Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to be referencing a video over on the Townsend channel. Now, he does videos that deal with the era of the 18th century, the colonial era. A lot of the cooking videos, but also the technology. Oops, I have earplugs in, sorry. Also the technology and the culture and history of that era. And he does some really, thanks, Cap. He does some really in-depth work. And he's done a video where he has someone talking about what their trekking kit would be. This is what the kind of gear that they would have on their person when they're moving through temperate environments from point A to point B, not long term, but definitely out there in the wilderness. And I think it's interesting because I think it gives a really solid basis for the kind of equipment and how it would be carried for your average adventurer. Because if you look at a lot of the adventuring kits out there, like you look at it, it doesn't really matter what game you're looking at, but you look at the standard adventuring gear for your, standard bog standard medium to high fantasy game. There's a lot of gear that sometimes people are carrying which is very niche and isn't going to necessarily be the kind of thing that you're going to want on a daily basis. If you talk to folks who are really into the everyday carry movement, such as myself, you'll discover that there are things that you carry and discover, I really don't need this, and you stop carrying it. And I think that a lot of the stuff that you see in adventuring kits falls into that category. Now, the two items that he doesn't talk about in this video, because I think they would have just been assumed, would have definitely been a knife. He would have been carrying some kind of a knife. And he very likely could have been carrying a tomahawk, because tomahawks are very handy both for producing kindling and things like that, feather sticks, things like that, that might, for starting fires, but also as being used as a light hammer. And tomahawks were ubiquitous in the era. So those two things, I think we kind of assume that he would definitely have a knife. Everybody's going to carry a knife. And he very well might have a tomahawk as well. Other than that, he is carrying the equipment he needs to keep himself getting from point A to point B successfully. Now, this is 18th century, so he is carrying a flintlock rifle. There's also an excellent video on the same channel that was put up at the same week, or within a week of this one, which talks about how to do field stripping and cleaning of a flintlock rifle, which is also very good. Now, that may not be applicable to a lot of fantasy settings, but it is applicable to some. Some settings do, in fact, have firearms in them. For example, in the Pathfinder Galarian world, there are not only flintlock muzzle-loading weapons, but there are actually cartridged firearms available in the world, which are even more advanced than the type of weapons that are being discussed here. So you could very well find that perfectly applicable to your game. But it's not difficult to understand that a person could be carrying a crossbow or a bow, and a crossbow is going to need as much gear to keep it in operation as a flintlock rifle, which is why I always consider flintlock should really be considered simple weapons and not martial or exotics, because if you can use a heavy crossbow, because they're pretty complex devices, then you can use a flintlock muzzleloader, because there's a lot of moving parts, literally and figuratively, involved in using a heavy crossbow. And a bow, while far simpler, still has things that require maintenance, and the gear you need to make and maintain your arrows, your fletching gear, is also going to be something to be carrying. But for example, the way the knapsack is carried and the bedroll is carried on top of it, just kind of resting on top of it, so that the weight of the bedroll is sitting on top of the knapsack, I think is quite good. And I think that it's going to surprise some people that how large a bedroll is. A lot of the times when you see images of adventuring gear, the bedroll is the size of a modern sleeping bag. And that's not what a bedroll was. A bedroll is a bigger object because the technology was lower and they didn't have things like really super thin nylon materials and insulation that could be compacted into a nice neat little container that just sticks up underneath a backpack on your back. Bedrolls were much more substantial items, and the person in this isn't not carrying any real kind of shelter, but it wouldn't be difficult to say wrap the bedroll in a oilcloth or a tarp to produce a simple shelter. And there are numerous simple shelter designs that you can find on YouTube that use a single tarp. So finding videos about that are very easy, and that's the kind of thing that a person could very well carry. Now, another thing you could also carry that isn't hugely bulky would be a hammock. So a person could have a tarp and a hammock and a bedroll, and that's not going to be a huge addition of equipment that allow them to camp off the ground. The technology existed to have that kind of thing, and I mean, let's face it, hammocks were available on ships, so it wouldn't be difficult to have a hammock that could be carried for camping. And in the more slightly advanced settings, you could definitely have hammocks that were more of the net variety as opposed to a piece of, say, basically sailcloth with ropes at the end, which is the kind of thing that you would find being used on ship. Just tarp essentially being slung between two posts. The technology was a little more primitive, but a net style hammock could exist if you were kind of throw in the kind of fantasy technology that is available. More exotic types of silks and things like that, which might let you create stronger nets, things like that. But the way he carries his food, the way he carries his clothing, the types of clothing, he's going to be able to cover 3 seasons with what he's got there on his body. He's not going to be able to cover winter. Winter would require a little more coverage than he's got, but not much, because you have to realize that folks that spend a lot of time outdoors are inured to the elements to a degree that the average person that is sitting in an office with a cat in their shoulder is. You people are just a little hardier. You have to remember, in an era before shoes, people everywhere walked barefoot year-round, and people only wore shoes in severe weather if they lived in an environment that was going to have really long, cold winters. And light snow, yeah, people would just walk barefoot in a lot of that situations because they didn't necessarily have any options, or they'd be wearing moccasins, things like that. They wouldn't necessarily be wearing what we would consider, heavy-duty clothing. The video, I think, however, is very informative, well produced, and I think it's going to give you a good idea of the types of things that you can expect for an actual adventurer to be carrying when moving from place to place. This is the kind of thing that's going to allow a person to move from town to town quite easily. Not necessarily doing long range adventuring, but when your average adventurer isn't doing that, they're just moving from place to place, point A to point B. If they're going to be going out full time, then they're going to be having more gear with them. They may carry actual proper tents, or using magic and things like that to supply them with shelter in a way that you can't in a real world setting. So I'm going to suggest you go check the video out and get to see what a person who actually spends time in the outdoors in a more primitive technological era carried on a daily basis. I found it very interesting, and I think that it's the kind of thing that is the springboard for what we adventurers should be carrying, at least theoretical adventurers, in our fantasy settings.